The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Marcus, I need space for my heart to figure things out." My wife Victoria stood in our kitchen doorway, her silhouette framed by the morning light streaming through our Portland home. She was dressed in that cream-colored blouse I'd bought her for Christmas, her dark hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. But her voice carried no vulnerability. It carried rehearsal. I set down my espresso cup on the marble counter and reached into the drawer next to the sink. The manila envelope crinkled as I pulled it out, the one I'd been carrying in my briefcase for 2 weeks, waiting for this exact moment. "Here's all the space you'll ever need," I said, sliding the divorce papers across the island toward her. Victoria's face went white. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she was trying to catch words that had suddenly fled. She stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "What is this?" she whispered. "Freedom," I replied, taking another sip of my espresso. "Exactly what you asked for." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've spent the last 15 years building financial models for investment firms here in Portland, Oregon. Numbers don't lie. They can't manipulate you, they can't gaslight you, and they certainly can't look you in the eye and ask for space while planning their exit strategy behind your back. That morning, watching Victoria fumble through the papers with trembling hands, I realized she'd made the same mistake that failing companies make when they try to cook their books. She assumed I wasn't paying attention to the data. Victoria and I had been married for 11 years. We'd met at a wine tasting in the Pearl District back when I was still working 70-hour weeks at a startup that eventually got bought out by Goldman Sachs. She was working in marketing for a local hotel chain, bright and ambitious, with a laugh that could fill a room. We bought the house in Laurelhurst 3 years into our marriage, a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that overlooked the rose garden she insisted on planting. For a long time, it worked. We had routines that felt like small traditions: Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Sunday hikes in Forest Park, dinner parties where Victoria would spend hours preparing elaborate meals for friends who praised her cooking skills and envied our seemingly perfect life. From the outside, we looked like the poster couple for successful Portland professionals. 2 careers on the rise, a beautiful home, no kids yet, but plenty of time for that later. But somewhere around year 8, the soundtrack of our marriage changed. The conversations grew shorter, more transactional. She stopped asking about my work beyond the polite questions you might ask a neighbor. I stopped sharing the small victories and frustrations that make up the daily rhythm of building a career. We weren't fighting, which somehow made it worse. Fighting would have required passion, investment, the belief that the relationship was worth the energy of conflict. Instead, we drifted into the kind of polite coexistence that marriage counselors probably have nightmares about. We were roommates who happened to share a tax return and a mortgage. Victoria still smiled when we ran into friends at Whole Foods, still reached for my hand during movies, still said "I love you" before bed, but it all felt choreographed, like she was performing the role of wife rather than being one. The first crack in her performance showed up in February. I was reviewing our joint credit card statement, something I did monthly as part of my financial planning routine, when I noticed a charge that didn't fit our usual patterns. $237 at a restaurant called Le Bernardine in downtown Portland. I'd never heard of the place, and Victoria had never mentioned going there. When I asked her about it, she barely looked up from her laptop. "Oh, that was lunch with Sarah from work. We were celebrating her promotion." Her tone was casual, dismissive, the way you might explain buying groceries or filling up the gas tank. But Sarah worked for a nonprofit that couldn't afford Le Bernardine-level celebrations, and Victoria had never been the type to splurge on expensive lunches, especially not during the week. The charge was dated on a Tuesday, right in the middle of her supposedly busy season at work. I didn't say anything. In financial analysis, you never draw conclusions from a single data point. You wait, you watch, you collect information until the pattern becomes undeniable. That was my first mistake, thinking I was analyzing a portfolio instead of watching my marriage dissolve in real time. March brought more irregularities. Victoria's schedule, which had been predictable for years, suddenly became fluid. She started working late more often, attending networking events she'd never mentioned before, taking weekend trips to Seattle that she claimed were for professional development. Her phone, which used to sit carelessly on the coffee table during dinner, now lived in her purse or pocket, buzzing with notifications she'd glance at with a small smile before quickly dismissing. The most telling change was in her appearance. Victoria had always been attractive, but in an understated way that matched her practical personality. She favored simple jewelry, minimal makeup, clothes that were professional but not attention-grabbing. But that spring, she started experimenting. New perfume that was heavier, more sophisticated than her usual light floral scent. Lingerie that appeared in our laundry that I'd never seen her wear. Dresses that were cut lower, fitted tighter, designed to catch eyes rather than blend into boardrooms. When I complimented her on a particularly striking red dress she wore to what she claimed was a client dinner, she blushed in a way that reminded me of when we first started dating.
"You really think it looks good?" she asked, turning in front of the bedroom mirror with an almost girlish uncertainty. But the question felt wrong somehow, like she was asking for validation from the wrong person. By April, I had enough data points to run a preliminary analysis. Victoria was exhibiting classic signs of what behavioral economists call exit planning. She was emotionally divesting from our relationship while simultaneously investing energy and resources elsewhere. The expensive lunches, the mysterious trips, the wardrobe updates, the phone secrecy, they all pointed to the same conclusion. She was preparing for a life that didn't include me. Most men in my position would have confronted her. They would have demanded explanations, threatened to check her phone, maybe even hired a private investigator. But I've spent my career studying market behaviors, and I know that confronting a failing investment rarely saves it. It just accelerates the crash. Instead, I decided to do what I do best: gather comprehensive data and plan my exit strategy. The investigation wasn't difficult. Victoria thought she was being careful, but she was used to living with someone who trusted her completely. She'd grown sloppy in the way that people do when they assume they're not being watched. Her laptop was usually open on the kitchen counter, her email account stayed logged in, and she kept all her receipts in a shoebox in our shared closet, the same organizational system she'd used for years. I didn't snoop in the dramatic way that suspicious spouses do in movies. I didn't rifle through her belongings or follow her around town. I simply paid attention to the information that was already available, analyzing it with the same methodical approach I used for investment portfolios. And what I found was a masterclass in financial and emotional infidelity. The credit card statements told the clearest story. Victoria had been using our joint account to fund what was essentially a parallel relationship. $300 dinners at restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance. Weekend stays at boutique hotels in wine country that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. Shopping sprees at lingerie stores and high-end boutiques that coincided with her mysterious business trips. But the most damning evidence was in her web browser history. She'd been researching apartments in Seattle, looking at job listings for marketing positions with companies that would represent a significant step up from her current role. She'd been pricing divorce attorneys, reading articles about asset division in Oregon, even browsing dating sites with a profile that was still in draft mode but clearly ready to launch. Victoria wasn't just having an affair, she was planning a complete life overhaul, and she was using our shared resources to fund her transition to a future that didn't include me. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it brought an odd sense of relief. The uncertainty was over. The waiting was finished. I finally had enough information to make an informed decision about the direction of my own life. That's when I called David Richardson, a divorce attorney whose name I'd found through a colleague who'd gone through his own messy separation 2 years earlier. David was expensive, thorough, and refreshingly direct about the realities of divorce in Oregon. We met at his downtown office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray Portland day that makes even the most optimistic person consider moving somewhere with more sunshine. "You seem remarkably calm for someone who just discovered their wife is planning to leave," David observed, as I laid out the evidence I'd compiled. Financial records, browser histories, a timeline of suspicious activities that read like a case study in relationship fraud. "Most of my clients come in here either furious or devastated. You're presenting this like a business proposal." I leaned back in the leather chair across from his desk, watching the rain streak down the windows of his corner office. "Because that's what marriage is, isn't it? A business partnership with emotional components. Victoria has decided to breach our contract. I'm simply responding with appropriate legal remedies." David raised an eyebrow. "That's a remarkably clinical way to view the end of an 11-year marriage. It's a remarkably effective way to protect my interests while she's busy protecting hers." 3 weeks later, the papers were ready. Oregon's no-fault divorce laws meant I didn't need to prove Victoria's infidelity to end our marriage, but the evidence I'd gathered would be crucial for property division and spousal support negotiations. David had crafted a settlement proposal that was fair but firm, protecting the assets I'd brought into the marriage while acknowledging Victoria's contributions to our shared life. I kept the manila envelope in my briefcase, waiting for the right moment to present it. I didn't want to ambush Victoria, but I also didn't want to give her the satisfaction of controlling the narrative around our divorce. She'd been managing the story of our relationship for months, presenting herself as the dutiful wife while secretly auditing for her replacement. It was time for me to take back some agency in my own life. The moment came on a Tuesday morning in late May. Portland was experiencing one of those perfect spring days that reminds you why people fall in love with the Pacific Northwest despite the 9 months of rain. The roses in our garden were blooming, filling the kitchen with a sweet fragrance that drifted through the open windows. Victoria had made coffee in our expensive espresso machine, the one that she'd insisted we needed to replicate the cafe experience at home. She was standing by the island, scrolling through her phone with that small smile that had become so familiar over the past few months. The smile that meant she was reading messages from someone that wasn't me, someone who made her feel excited about life in a way that our marriage no longer did. "Marcus," she said without looking down from her screen, "I've been thinking about us, about our relationship." I set down my espresso cup and waited. After months of analysis, I knew this speech was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria had been building toward this conversation, dropping hints and creating distance until she felt confident enough to ask for what she really wanted. "I feel like we've grown apart over the years. We're not the same people we were when we got married." She finally looked up from her phone, her brown eyes wide with practiced sincerity. "I think I need some space to figure out what I really want from life. Space for my heart to understand what makes me truly happy." There it was, the carefully worded request that sounded like introspection, but was actually a polite way of asking permission to pursue the relationship she'd already started. Victoria wanted me to grant her temporary freedom so she could test drive her new life without the inconvenience of being legally single. If things didn't work out with her mystery man, she could always come back to the security of our marriage. If they did work out, she'd have positioned herself as the thoughtful spouse who tried to work things out rather than the cheating wife who abandoned her husband. That's when I reached for the drawer and pulled out the envelope. "Here's all the space you'll ever need." Victoria stared at the divorce papers like they were some kind of optical illusion. She flipped through the first few pages, her eyes scanning the legal language that formally dissolved our marriage and divided our assets. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like respect. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "About your affair?" 3 months. "About you planning to leave?" "Longer." She closed the papers and set them on the counter between us. "I never meant for it to happen this way." "No, you meant for it to happen your way. You wanted to control the timeline, manage the narrative, minimize the inconvenience to yourself.
I finished my espresso and rinsed the cup in the sink. But marriage isn't a performance you can direct. It's a partnership, and partners don't audition replacements behind each other's backs. Victoria's carefully composed expression finally cracked. I was confused, Marcus. I didn't know how to talk to you about what I was feeling. You weren't confused. You were calculating. There's a difference. I left her standing in the kitchen with the papers and went upstairs to pack a bag. I'd already signed a lease on a furnished apartment in the Pearl District, a clean, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. It wasn't home yet, but it was honest, and after months of living in an elaborate performance, honesty felt like luxury. When I came back downstairs with my suitcase, Victoria was still at the kitchen island, but now she was crying. Real tears, not the practiced moisture that had appeared during her "space for my heart" speech. She looked up at me with a vulnerability that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with 11 years earlier. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I really am." I believed her. Victoria wasn't a cruel person, just a selfish one who'd convinced herself that her feelings justified her actions. She was sorry that things had gotten complicated, sorry that she'd hurt me, sorry that her careful plan had been exposed, but she wasn't sorry enough to change, and we both knew it. I know you are, but sorry doesn't undo the choices you made. It just acknowledges that there were consequences. The apartment in the Pearl District was everything our Laurelhurst house wasn't. Modern instead of historic, minimal instead of cluttered, mine instead of ours. The living room had a view of the city skyline. The kitchen was designed for someone who ate simple meals rather than elaborate dinner parties. And the bedroom held only my clothes, my books, my life. For the first week, I felt like I was living in a hotel. Everything was too clean, too quiet, too unfamiliar. I missed the creaky floorboards of our old house, the way the morning light filtered through the rose garden. Even the sound of Victoria moving around the kitchen, making her elaborate breakfast routines. But I didn't miss the tension, the careful conversations, the constant feeling that I was living with a stranger who happened to know my schedule. Gradually, the apartment began to feel like home. I established new routines that revolved around my preferences rather than our compromises. I watched the financial news during breakfast instead of listening to Victoria's detailed recaps of her coworkers' personal dramas. I ate dinner at the counter while reviewing client portfolios instead of sitting through stilted conversations about our days. I went to bed when I was tired instead of waiting for Victoria to finish her elaborate skincare routine. The silence wasn't lonely. It was honest. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing the role of husband for an audience who was secretly critiquing my performance while rehearsing her exit speech. 3 weeks after I moved out, Victoria called. I was working late in my home office, analyzing quarterly reports for a client's retirement portfolio, when my phone buzzed with her name.
I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. Marcus? Her voice was small, uncertain in a way that reminded me of our early dating days. Can we talk? We're talking now. I mean, in person. I miss you. I miss us. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the lights of downtown Portland. The city looked different from this height. More organized, less chaotic than it seemed from street level. Victoria, what exactly do you miss? The marriage we actually had, or the marriage you performed for other people? She was quiet for a long moment. I made a mistake, Marcus. I got confused about what I wanted, and I hurt you in the process. But we had 11 good years together. That has to count for something. It counts for exactly what it was worth. 11 years of shared history that you decided to trade for something more exciting. I saved the file I'd been working on and closed my laptop. You asked for space to figure out what makes you truly happy. Did you figure it out? Another pause. I figured out that happiness isn't as simple as I thought it was. No, you figured out that the grass isn't always greener, especially when you have to maintain it yourself. Victoria's voice sharpened with frustration. Why are you being so cold about this? We were married for 11 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It means I invested 11 years in something that you decided wasn't worth preserving. It means I trusted someone who was actively planning to leave while pretending to work on our relationship. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the late commuters make their way home to lives that were hopefully more honest than mine had been. It means I learned not to confuse history with potential. Marcus, please, can we at least try counseling? Can we see if there's anything left worth saving? The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I considered it. Victoria sounded genuinely remorseful, and there was a part of me that remembered what it felt like to be happy with her, to believe in the future we were building together. But then I thought about the credit card statements, the secret apartment searches, the months of careful deception that had preceded her request for space. Victoria, you didn't ask for counseling when you were unhappy in our marriage. You asked for it now that you're unhappy with your alternatives. That tells me everything I need to know about what this relationship means to you. I heard her crying on the other end of the line, soft sobs that might have moved me 3 months earlier. Now they just sounded like another performance, the final act in a play where she got to be both the villain and the victim. I'm going to hang up now, I said gently. Take care of yourself. I ended the call and turned off my phone. Outside, Portland stretched out below me, full of people making choices, living with consequences, figuring out how to build honest lives in a world that often rewards deception. I had client reports to review, investment strategies to develop, a future to plan that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in months, that future felt full of possibility rather than obligation. Victoria had asked for space for her heart to figure things out. I'd given her all the space in the world, and in the process, I'd finally given myself room to breathe. The divorce was finalized on a crisp October morning, exactly 5 months after Victoria's request for space. David Richardson had negotiated a settlement that protected my investments while ensuring Victoria received her fair share of our shared assets. She kept the house in Laurelhurst, which made sense since she'd been the one to plant the rose garden and choose the paint colors. I kept my retirement accounts and the downtown condo I'd purchased as a rental property 2 years earlier. We met one last time to sign the final papers, not in a courtroom, but in David's office, surrounded by law books and the smell of expensive coffee. Victoria looked different, older somehow, as if the past few months had aged her in ways that went beyond the calendar. She was wearing the red dress I'd complimented her on earlier that year, the one that had made her blush with pleasure at my approval. I want you to know that I appreciate how you handled all of this. You could have made it much more difficult. I looked at her across the conference table, this woman who'd shared 11 years of my life and then decided it wasn't enough. Making it difficult would have served whose interests exactly? She smiled sadly. Always the analyst, even at the end. Especially at the end.
Emotions make for poor decision-making. The notary stamped our papers with a finality that felt both heavy and liberating. 11 years of marriage, reduced to legal documents, asset schedules, and official seals. Victoria gathered her copies into her purse with the careful precision of someone who didn't want to drop anything important. "Will you be happy?" she asked as we prepared to leave. I considered the question seriously. Happiness wasn't something I'd thought much about during our marriage. I'd focused on success, security, the steady accumulation of achievements and assets that were supposed to add up to a satisfying life. But happiness, the simple pleasure of waking up each day without dread or disappointment, that was something I was still learning to recognize. "I'll be honest," I said, "and for me, that's close enough." 6 months later, I was reviewing quarterly reports in my downtown office when my assistant knocked on my door. "There's a call for you in line 3. Says she's an old friend." I picked up the phone without checking the caller ID, expecting a former colleague or college acquaintance. Instead, I heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "Marcus, it's Emma. Emma Rodriguez, from the wine tasting where you met Victoria." I leaned back in my chair, surprised by how clearly I remembered her. Emma had been Victoria's friend from her marketing job, the one with the infectious laugh and the tendency to ask thoughtful questions about whatever books she was reading. She'd been at our wedding, sent Christmas cards for the first few years, then gradually faded from our social circle the way work friends often do when people change jobs. Emma, it's been what, 7 years? At least. I heard about you and Victoria. I'm sorry. Thank you. Though I'm not sure sorry is the right word. It ended the way it needed to end. She laughed, the same warm sound I remembered from those early wine tastings. That's very diplomatic. Victoria always said you were the most logical person she knew. Victoria said a lot of things. Not all of them were accurate. Fair enough. Emma paused, and I could hear traffic in the background, the sounds of a city that wasn't Portland. I'm actually calling because I'm moving back to Portland next month. New job at Nike, heading up their sustainability marketing. I was wondering if you might want to grab coffee sometime, catch up on the last 7 years. I found myself smiling at the proposal. I'd like that, though I should warn you, I'm not the same person I was when you knew me before. None of us are. That's what makes catching up interesting. We made plans to meet at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, not far from my apartment. After I hung up, I sat at my desk thinking about the strange circularity of life, how people drift in and out of your orbit, sometimes returning when you least expect them and most need the reminder that the world is bigger than your immediate circumstances. Emma had been there at the beginning of my relationship with Victoria, a witness to those early days when everything felt possible and permanent. Now she was calling at the end, not as Victoria's friend, but as someone who remembered a version of me that existed before the performance, before the careful distance, before the slow dissolution of trust. I looked out the window at the Portland skyline, the same view I'd been staring at for months as I rebuilt my life from the ground up. The city looked different in the late afternoon light, softer somehow, full of possibilities I was only beginning to recognize. Victoria had asked for space, for her heart to figure things out. She'd wanted room to explore what would make her truly happy, freedom to pursue the excitement that our marriage no longer provided. I'd given her exactly what she asked for, along with a lesson about the difference between wanting space and earning it. But in giving her that space, I'd discovered something unexpected. I'd found room for my own heart to figure things out, space to remember who I was when I wasn't performing the role of husband for an audience that was already planning her exit. I'd learned that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is to stop trying to save them from the consequences of their choices. The phone rang again, and I answered it with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. Outside, Portland glowed in the autumn sun, full of people making choices, living with consequences, and figuring out how to build honest lives in a world that often rewards the performance of happiness over the pursuit of it. Victoria had gotten her space. I'd gotten my truth. And sometimes truth turned out to be the most generous gift you could give yourself. Emma Rodriguez walked into the coffee shop 15 minutes late. Her dark hair windswept from the October breeze that had been rattling Portland's windows all week. She spotted me immediately at the corner table, the one with the view of the food trucks and the constant stream of Nike employees grabbing their afternoon caffeine fix. When she smiled, I remembered why Victoria had always seemed slightly intimidated by her presence at social gatherings. "Marcus Chen, looking exactly the same as always," she said, sliding into the chair across from me, though maybe a little less tense around the eyes. I handed her the latte I'd ordered, remembering her preference for oat milk and an extra shot. 11 years will do that to a person, either make you more tense or force you to let go of things you can't control. Emma wrapped her hands around the cup, studying my face with the same directness I remembered from those wine tastings. She'd always been the one asking follow-up questions, digging deeper into conversations that others were content to keep on the surface. "Victoria mentioned you were working too much, focusing too much on numbers and not enough on feelings. I always thought that was an interesting criticism coming from someone who treated relationships like marketing campaigns." The observation caught me off guard, not because it was harsh, but because it was accurate. Victoria had always approached our social life with the same strategic thinking she applied to her work, calculating which events to attend, which couples to befriend, which image to project at any given moment. I'd assumed it was just her professional instincts bleeding into personal life, but Emma's comment made me wonder if it had been something more deliberate. "You saw that even back then?" Emma nodded, taking a careful sip of her latte. "Victoria was always performing, always aware of her audience. Even at her own wedding, she seemed more focused on how everything looked than how it felt. I remember thinking you seemed like the kind of person who valued authenticity and wondering how that would work long term. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications of what she was saying. You thought our marriage was doomed from the beginning? I thought you were two very different people who wanted different things from life. That doesn't always doom a marriage, but it requires both people to be honest about who they are and what they need. Emma's voice was gentle, but matter-of-fact. Victoria was never particularly good at honest self-reflection. The conversation continued for 2 hours, flowing with the ease of people who had known each other in a different context but were discovering new dimensions to their connection. Emma told me about her years in San Francisco, working for a tech startup that had burned through venture capital faster than it could develop a viable product. She'd learned hard lessons about the difference between innovation and hype, between sustainable growth and the kind of explosive expansion that inevitably leads to collapse. It sounds like you learned some of the same lessons I did, I said as we prepared to leave, about the importance of solid fundamentals over flashy presentations. Emma laughed, pulling on her jacket as the October wind picked up outside. The difference is I learned it from failing companies. You learned it from a failing marriage. We walked together toward the parking garage, our conversation shifting to lighter topics, but I found myself thinking about her observation long after we'd said goodbye. Victoria had always been attracted to the flashy presentation, the dramatic gesture, the kind of life that looked impressive from the outside. I'd provided stability and security, but perhaps what she'd really wanted was excitement and unpredictability. 2 weeks later, Emma called to invite me to a book club meeting at her new apartment in the Alberta Arts District. It's just 4 people so far, all transplants trying to rebuild social circles in Portland. We're reading The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo this month, which seemed appropriately dramatic given everyone's recent romantic complications. I'd never been much of a book club person, but the invitation felt like an opportunity to expand beyond the narrow social world Victoria and I had created together. Our friend group had consisted primarily of her work colleagues and their spouses, people who spoke in marketing jargon and seemed perpetually focused on networking opportunities. The prospect of conversations that centered around ideas rather than career advancement appealed to me in ways I hadn't expected. The book club met in Emma's living room, a space that managed to feel both sophisticated and comfortable. Unlike the carefully curated aesthetic Victoria had insisted on in the Laurelhurst house, Emma's apartment reflected genuine personal taste rather than magazine-worthy interior design. Mismatched furniture that somehow worked together, bookshelves filled with actual books rather than decorative objects, art on the walls that had clearly been chosen for personal meaning rather than resale value. The other members were equally refreshing. James, a software engineer who'd moved from Austin after a startup acquisition had eliminated his job. Sarah, a nurse practitioner who'd relocated from Chicago to be closer to her aging parents. Michael, a freelance graphic designer who'd left Los Angeles when the cost of living had made creative work financially impossible. All of them were rebuilding their lives in Portland, all of them were thoughtful about books and ideas, and none of them seemed particularly interested in discussing their professional achievements or networking opportunities. So, Marcus, Sarah said as we discussed the novel's themes of identity and performance, what did you think about Evelyn's strategy of controlling her public narrative, the way she managed every detail of how the world perceived her? I considered the question, thinking about the parallels between the fictional character's life and my recent experiences. I think it's exhausting to maintain that level of control over other people's perceptions. Eventually, the performance becomes more important than the reality, and you lose track of who you actually are underneath all the strategic presentation. Emma shot me a meaningful look across the room. That's a very specific analysis. Sounds like you've had some experience with people who prioritize image management over authentic relationships. The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on themes of truth and deception, the difference between privacy and secrecy, the ways that people construct public identities that may or may not reflect their inner lives. I found myself contributing more than I'd expected, drawing connections between the book's themes and observations about human behavior that I'd developed through years of analyzing market patterns and investor psychology. Driving home that night, I realized I hadn't thought about Victoria once during the entire evening. For the first time since our divorce, I'd spent hours in social conversation without feeling like I was performing the role of the recently divorced man or managing other people's expectations about how I should be processing my changed circumstances. I'd simply been myself, engaging with ideas and people who seemed genuinely interested in authentic connection rather than strategic networking. The book club became a monthly anchor in my social calendar, but Emma and I started spending time together outside the group as well. She'd call on Friday afternoons to suggest hiking in Forest Park or checking out a new restaurant in Southeast Portland. Our conversations ranged from serious discussions about career transitions and life goals to lighter debates about the best coffee roasters in the city and whether the Trailblazers had any chance of making the playoffs. What surprised me most was how easy it felt. With Victoria, social activities required advanced planning, careful coordination of schedules, and often involved compromises about where to go and what to do.
With Emma, plans evolved organically. She might text on Saturday morning to suggest a farmer's market visit, or call on a sunny afternoon to propose a drive to the coast. Her spontaneity felt refreshing rather than chaotic, and I found myself saying yes to invitations I would have overthought into rejection during my marriage. "You're different than I remembered," Emma said one evening as we walked along the riverfront after dinner at a Vietnamese restaurant in the Jade District. "More relaxed, more willing to deviate from plans." I considered her observation, watching the lights from the bridges reflect in the Willamette River. Victoria always said I was too rigid, too focused on systems and schedules. Maybe she was right about that. Or maybe you were rigid because you were living with someone who made spontaneity feel dangerous, Emma replied. Some people bring out your flexibility, others make you feel like you need more structure to protect yourself. The insight hit me with unexpected force. During my marriage, I'd gradually become more controlling about schedules and plans, more insistent on advance notice and detailed coordination. I'd attributed it to professional stress or natural aging, but Emma's comment made me wonder if it had been a defensive response to living with someone whose unpredictability felt threatening rather than exciting. Victoria's schedule changes had always come with an edge of anxiety for me, not because I opposed flexibility in principle, but because her last-minute alterations to plans often felt like tests or power plays rather than genuine spontaneity. When she announced that she'd made dinner reservations without consulting me, or decided to visit her sister in Seattle without much advance notice, there was often an undertone of challenge in her announcement, as if she were daring me to object or trying to establish her independence in ways that felt unnecessarily confrontational. With Emma, spontaneity felt collaborative rather than competitive. When she suggested changing our dinner plans to try a food truck she'd heard about, or extending our hike to explore a trail we hadn't planned to visit, the decisions felt like shared adventures rather than unilateral declarations. The difference wasn't just in her communication style, but in the underlying trust that her suggestions were motivated by genuine enthusiasm rather than strategic positioning. 3 months into our renewed friendship, Emma and I were having dinner at her apartment when she brought up Victoria directly, for the first time since our initial coffee meeting. We'd been talking about a mutual acquaintance's recent engagement, debating whether elaborate wedding celebrations reflected genuine joy or social pressure, when Emma set down her wine glass and looked at me seriously. "Can I ask you something personal about your marriage? You don't have to answer if you're not comfortable with it." I nodded, curious about what she wanted to know. "Did you love Victoria, or did you love the idea of being married to someone like Victoria?" The question was more complex than it initially appeared. I'd told myself for years that I loved Victoria, had built our entire relationship on that assumption, but Emma's phrasing forced me to examine the distinction between loving a person and loving the concept of the life that person represented. I think I loved who Victoria was when we first met. She was ambitious and confident and seemed to know exactly what she wanted from life. That clarity was attractive to me, especially since I was still figuring out my own career direction. Emma waited for me to continue, not filling the silence with commentary or follow-up questions. But somewhere along the way, I think I fell in love with the stability of being married more than I loved Victoria herself. The routine, the shared goals, the sense of building something together. When that stability started to feel threatened, I focused on protecting the institution of our marriage rather than addressing whether we were actually compatible as people. And Victoria? I considered the question, thinking back over the years of our relationship with the kind of analytical distance that divorce proceedings had forced me to develop. Victoria loved the idea of being married to someone successful and reliable. I provided security and social respectability, but I don't think she ever loved me as an individual. I was more like a supporting character in the life story she was writing for herself. Emma refilled our wine glasses, her expression thoughtful. That's a remarkably honest assessment. Most people aren't willing to admit that their marriages were built on mutual utility rather than genuine connection. The alternative is admitting that I wasted 11 years of my life on something that was never real to begin with. Or, Emma said gently, accepting that those 11 years taught you important things about what you actually want from a relationship, which makes them valuable even if they didn't result in lasting partnership. The conversation stayed with me for days afterwards, not because it was painful, but because it felt like the first time I'd been completely honest with another person about the reality of my marriage. Victoria and I had maintained the fiction of romantic love long after it had been replaced by practical partnership, and even during our divorce proceedings, we'd spoken in the language of relationships that had simply grown apart, rather than acknowledging that we'd never been as compatible as we'd pretended. With Emma, I didn't feel the need to protect Victoria's reputation or maintain the narrative of a once happy marriage that had gradually deteriorated. I could acknowledge that our relationship had been built on mutual convenience rather than deep connection, that we'd chosen each other for strategic reasons rather than emotional compatibility, and that the affair had been a symptom of deeper incompatibilities rather than a betrayal of genuine love. This honesty felt liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For months after the divorce, I'd carried a sense of failure, as if I had somehow been inadequate as a husband or partner. But examining the relationship with Emma's help, I began to understand that the failure hadn't been in my performance of the role, but in accepting a role that was never authentic to begin with. Victoria wanted a husband who would provide stability and social status while giving her the freedom to pursue excitement elsewhere. I wanted a wife who would provide companionship and shared goals while respecting my need for order and predictability. Neither of us were particularly interested in the complex work of understanding and supporting each other's authentic selves, and our marriage had essentially been a business partnership disguised as a romantic relationship. Recognizing this pattern allowed me to approach my developing friendship with Emma from a completely different foundation. Instead of trying to perform the role of an ideal friend or romantic prospect, I could simply be myself and see whether authentic connection was possible. Instead of managing impressions or strategic positioning, I could focus on genuine compatibility and mutual interest. The relief of this approach was immense. Conversations with Emma flowed naturally because I wasn't calculating how to present myself in the most favorable light. Plans evolved organically because I wasn't trying to demonstrate my reliability or sophistication. Physical attraction developed gradually because it was based on actually knowing each other rather than projecting idealized versions of ourselves onto each other. 6 months after our first coffee meeting, Emma and I were hiking in the Columbia River Gorge when she stopped at an overlook and turned to me directly. "I need to tell you something serious. I'm attracted to you. And I think you're attracted to me, but I don't want to assume anything or make this awkward if I'm misreading the situation." Her directness was so refreshing after years of Victoria's indirect communication style that I almost laughed. "You're not misreading anything. I've been thinking the same thing, but wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding like I was rushing into something. Are you ready for something romantic, or do you need more time to process the divorce?" I appreciated that she was asking directly, rather than trying to interpret my signals or manipulate me into making the first move. I'm ready for something honest. Whether that becomes romantic depends on how well we actually know each other, not on some timeline for getting over my marriage. Emma smiled, the kind of genuine expression that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. Good answer. Very analytical, but also very human.
We spent the rest of the hike talking about what we wanted from a potential relationship, what we'd learned from previous partnerships, what kind of timeline felt comfortable for exploring romantic possibilities. The conversation was more explicit and practical than any relationship discussion I'd ever had, but it felt infinitely more romantic than the elaborate gestures and unspoken expectations that had characterized my marriage. By the time we reached the parking lot, we'd established that we were interested in dating each other exclusively, that we both preferred gradual physical intimacy over dramatic passion, and that we valued honest communication over romantic fantasy. It wasn't the kind of beginning that would make for compelling movie dialogue, but it felt sustainable in ways that my whirlwind courtship with Victoria never had. Our first official date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the Alberta district, the kind of place that focused on excellent food rather than impressive atmosphere. Emma wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and I found myself noticing details about her that I'd overlooked during our friendship: the way she used her hands when she talked, the particular tone her laugh took on when she found something genuinely amusing rather than socially appropriate to laugh at. "So," she said over our shared appetizer, "tell me about your ideal relationship. Not what you think you should want, but what would actually make you happy." I considered the question seriously, thinking beyond the conventional answers about companionship and shared goals. I want someone who's interested in building a real life together rather than performing a successful relationship. Someone who's curious about the world and willing to have conversations that go beyond daily logistics. Someone who's genuinely content with simple pleasures rather than always seeking the next exciting experience. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like someone who's learned the difference between sustainable happiness and dramatic satisfaction. What about you? What would make you happy in a relationship? Someone who's emotionally available without being needy, someone who has their own interests and goals but also wants to share experiences with a partner, someone who can handle conflict through direct conversation rather than passive-aggressive manipulation. She paused, twirling pasta around her fork. Basically, someone who's interested in being a genuine partner rather than playing relationship games. The evening continued with the kind of conversation that makes you lose track of time, ranging from serious topics about values and goals to lighter discussions about travel preferences and favorite books. When Emma mentioned that she'd always wanted to visit Iceland, I found myself suggesting that we research a trip together, not as an immediate commitment, but as a shared interest worth exploring. "You know what I like about talking with you?" Emma said as we walked to our cars after dinner. "You respond to what I actually say, rather than what you think I mean or what you wish I'd said. It's surprisingly rare." I unlocked her car door, a small gesture that felt natural rather than performative. Probably because I'm not trying to manage the conversation toward any particular outcome. I'm just interested in getting to know you better. Emma leaned against her car, looking up at me in the glow of the streetlight. "Can I kiss you, or would you prefer to wait until we've had a few more analytical discussions about relationship compatibility?" I laughed at her gentle teasing and leaned down to kiss her, a soft connection that felt like the natural conclusion to an evening of genuine conversation rather than the dramatic climax of romantic buildup. When we separated, Emma was smiling in a way that suggested satisfaction rather than overwhelming passion. "That was nice," she said simply. "Very promising for future development." Driving home that night, I reflected on how different this beginning felt from my early relationship with Victoria. With Victoria, our first kiss had been accompanied by immediate declarations of strong feelings, elaborate plans for future dates, and an intensity that felt romantic at the time, but in retrospect seemed more like mutual projection than genuine connection. With Emma, the beginning felt quieter but more solid, based on actual compatibility rather than idealized attraction. We were building something together rather than performing roles for each other, and the foundation felt strong enough to support whatever developed over time. 3 weeks later, Emma stayed over at my apartment for the first time. It wasn't a planned seduction or a dramatic escalation, but the natural result of an evening that had extended later than expected and a mutual reluctance to end our time together. She borrowed one of my t-shirts to sleep in, and we talked quietly in the dark about childhood memories and future plans until we fell asleep. Waking up next to Emma felt comfortable rather than awkward, another piece of evidence that we were compatible in practical ways as well as emotional ones. She made coffee while I showered, and we read the newspaper together over breakfast without feeling the need to fill the silence with conversation or commentary. "This feels surprisingly normal," Emma observed as she spread cream cheese on her bagel. "Like we've been doing this for months rather than weeks." I looked at her across my kitchen table, her hair messy from sleep, wearing my old Stanford t-shirt, and looking completely at ease in my space. Is that good or bad? It's perfect. Drama is overrated in relationships. I'd much rather have this kind of easy compatibility. Later that morning, as Emma gathered her things to leave for a work meeting, she paused in my hallway and looked around thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something? Do you miss being married, or do you just miss having someone around consistently?" The question made me think about the difference between loneliness and solitude, between wanting companionship and needing validation. I miss having someone to share experiences with, but I don't miss feeling like I had to perform the role of husband. Does that make sense? Emma nodded, pulling on her jacket. Perfect sense. Marriage should enhance who you are, not require you to become someone else.
After she left, I sat in my living room thinking about her observation. With Victoria, I'd gradually become a more controlled, more careful version of myself, someone who managed potential conflicts rather than addressing them directly, someone who focused on maintaining stability rather than pursuing growth or change. The role of husband in our marriage had required me to suppress aspects of my personality that Victoria found inconvenient or threatening. With Emma, I felt more like myself than I had in years, more spontaneous, more curious, more willing to express opinions that might lead to disagreement or discussion. She seemed to appreciate my analytical nature rather than finding it cold or distant, and she challenged my ideas in ways that felt engaging rather than critical. The relationship developed over the following months with a steadiness that felt both comfortable and exciting. We established routines that worked for both of us, compromised strategies that didn't require either of us to sacrifice important aspects of our personalities, and communication patterns that addressed problems before they became sources of resentment. Emma spent most weekends at my apartment, but maintained her own space and independence. We planned trips together, but also pursued individual interests and friendships. We had serious conversations about money, family expectations, and long-term goals, but we also laughed together more than I'd laughed with anyone in years. 8 months into our relationship, Emma brought up the subject of moving in together. We were lying in bed on a Sunday morning, reading and drinking coffee, when she set down her book and looked at me seriously. "How would you feel about the idea of living together? Not immediately, but sometime in the next few months." I'd been thinking about the same possibility, but hadn't known how to raise the subject without seeming presumptuous. "I'd like that, but I think we should be clear about what we're committing to and what we're not." Emma smiled at my characteristically practical response. "Okay, let's be clear. I'm talking about sharing living space because we enjoy each other's company and want to spend more time together, not because we're ready to merge our entire lives or make permanent commitments. And if it doesn't work out, we can adjust without it meaning the relationship has failed?" Exactly. Living together is an experiment, not a declaration of eternal commitment. We spent the next hour discussing practical details like lease arrangements, household responsibilities, and personal space requirements. The conversation was detailed and slightly unromantic, but it felt like the foundation for a sustainable life together, rather than a romantic gesture that might collapse under the weight of unexamined expectations. 2 months later, Emma officially moved into my apartment. The transition was smoother than either of us had expected. partly because we discussed potential problems in advance, but mostly because our natural rhythms and preferences were genuinely compatible. Emma was neat without being obsessive, social without being overwhelming, independent without being distant. Living together revealed new dimensions of our compatibility. Emma cooked elaborate dinners when she felt creative, but was equally happy with simple meals when work was busy. She enjoyed entertaining friends occasionally, but also appreciated quiet evenings at home. She had strong opinions about books and movies and politics, but expressed them in ways that invited discussion rather than demanding agreement. Most importantly, Emma seemed to appreciate rather than merely tolerate the aspects of my personality that Victoria had found problematic. My tendency to analyze situations thoroughly before making decisions, my preference for planning ahead rather than making spontaneous commitments, my focus on practical considerations rather than romantic gestures. "You know what I love about you?" Emma said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "You make decisions based on actual evidence rather than wishful thinking. It's incredibly attractive." I looked at her in surprise. "Victoria always said that made me boring and unromantic." Emma laughed, loading plates into the dishwasher. "Victoria wanted romance novel drama instead of real partnership. There's nothing boring about building a sustainable relationship with someone who actually pays attention to what works and what doesn't." Her comment crystallized something I'd been thinking about for months. Victoria had wanted me to be more spontaneous, more emotionally expressive, more willing to make grand gestures and dramatic declarations. But those changes would have required me to become a fundamentally different person, someone who prioritized emotional impact over practical sustainability. Emma appreciated my analytical nature because she shared similar values about building relationships on solid foundations rather than romantic intensity. She found my careful decision-making attractive because she'd also learned that impulsive choices often led to complications that were harder to resolve than they were to avoid. We were compatible not because we were identical, but because our differences complemented each other rather than creating conflict. Emma's spontaneity encouraged me to be more flexible, while my planning helped her avoid some of the chaos that pure spontaneity could create. Her emotional expressiveness helped me articulate feelings I might otherwise keep internal, while my analytical approach helped her think through decisions that might otherwise be purely emotional. A year after moving in together, Emma and I were planning a trip to Iceland when she brought up the subject of marriage. We were researching hotels in Reykjavik when she closed her laptop and looked at me with the direct expression I'd learned meant she wanted to discuss something important. "Can I ask how you feel about the idea of getting married again? Not necessarily to me, not necessarily soon, but as a general concept." I set down my own laptop, appreciating that she was asking about my thoughts rather than making assumptions or dropping hints. "I'd like that, but I think we should be clear about what we're committing to and what we're not." Emma smiled at my characteristically practical response. "Okay, let's be clear. I'm talking about sharing living space because we enjoy each other's company and want to spend more time together, not because we're ready to merge our entire lives or make permanent commitments. And if it doesn't work out, we can adjust without it meaning the relationship has failed?" Exactly. Living together is an experiment, not a declaration of eternal commitment. We spent the next hour discussing practical details like lease arrangements, household responsibilities, and personal space requirements. The conversation was detailed and slightly unromantic, but it felt like the foundation for a sustainable life together, rather than a romantic gesture that might collapse under the weight of unexamined expectations. 2 months later, Emma officially moved into my apartment. The transition was smoother than either of us had expected, partly because we'd discussed potential problems in advance, but mostly because our natural rhythms and preferences were genuinely compatible. Emma was neat without being obsessive, social without being overwhelming, independent without being distant. Living together revealed new dimensions of our compatibility. Emma cooked elaborate dinners when she felt creative, but was equally happy with simple meals when work was busy. She enjoyed entertaining friends occasionally, but also appreciated quiet evenings at home.
She had strong opinions about books and movies and politics, but expressed them in ways that invited discussion rather than demanding agreement. Most importantly, Emma seemed to appreciate rather than merely tolerate the aspects of my personality that Victoria had found problematic. My tendency to analyze situations thoroughly before making decisions. My preference for planning ahead rather than making spontaneous commitments. My focus on practical considerations rather than romantic gestures. "You know what I love about you," Emma said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner? "You make decisions based on actual evidence rather than wishful thinking. It's incredibly attractive." I looked at her in surprise. "Victoria always said that made me boring and unromantic." Emma laughed, loading plates into the dishwasher. "Victoria wanted romance novel drama instead of real partnership. There's nothing boring about building a sustainable relationship with someone who actually pays attention to what works and what doesn't." Her comment crystallized something I'd been thinking about for months. Victoria had wanted me to be more spontaneous, more emotionally expressive, more willing to make grand gestures and dramatic declarations. But those changes would have required me to become a fundamentally different person, someone who prioritized emotional impact over practical sustainability. Emma appreciated my analytical nature because she shared similar values about building relationships on solid foundations rather than romantic intensity. She found my careful decision-making attractive because she'd also learned that impulsive choices often led to complications that were harder to resolve than they were to avoid. We were compatible not because we were identical, but because our differences complemented each other rather than creating conflict. Emma's spontaneity encouraged me to be more flexible, while my planning helped her avoid some of the chaos that pure spontaneity could create. Her emotional expressiveness helped me articulate feelings I might otherwise keep internal, while my analytical approach helped her think through decisions that might otherwise be purely emotional. A year after moving in together, Emma and I were planning a trip to Iceland when she brought up the subject of marriage. We were researching hotels in Reykjavik when she closed her laptop and looked at me with the direct expression I'd learned meant she wanted to discuss something important. "Can I ask how you feel about the idea of getting married again? Not necessarily to me, not necessarily soon, but as a general concept." I set down my own laptop, appreciating that she was asking about my thoughts rather than making assumptions or dropping hints. "I think marriage can be valuable if both people are clear about what they're committing to and why. But I'd never want to get married again just because it's expected or because it seems like the next logical step." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "What would make marriage feel worthwhile to you?" "The legal protections and social recognition of a committed partnership. The formal acknowledgement that we're building a life together rather than just dating indefinitely." I paused, thinking about the deeper implications. "But only if the marriage enhanced what we already have, rather than changing the fundamental nature of our relationship." "So you wouldn't want to get married to prove our commitment or make our relationship more secure?" "Our commitment is demonstrated through our choices every day. Our security comes from compatibility and communication, not from legal contracts."
I reached for her hand across the table. "Though I would want to marry you specifically, if you were interested, because I can't imagine wanting to build a life with anyone else." Emma's smile was radiant, the kind of expression that transformed her entire face. "I was hoping you'd say something like that. I feel the same way about building a life with you." We spent the rest of the evening talking about what marriage would mean to us practically and emotionally, what kind of ceremony we'd want, what legal and financial arrangements would make sense. The conversation was detailed and pragmatic, but it felt more romantic than any grand gesture could have been, because it was based on genuine understanding and shared values. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony at the Portland Japanese Garden, surrounded by the friends who'd watched our relationship develop and supported our decision to formalize our commitment. Emma wore a simple white dress that she'd chosen because she loved it, not because it fulfilled anyone else's expectations about bridal fashion. I wore a suit I already owned, altered slightly for the occasion, but recognizably mine, rather than a costume for playing the role of groom. The ceremony itself was brief and personal, focused on our actual relationship rather than abstract ideals about marriage. We wrote our own vows, promising to continue building the kind of partnership we'd already established, rather than transforming into different people for the sake of being married. I promise to appreciate who you are, rather than trying to change you into who I think you should be, Emma said, her voice steady and clear. I promise to communicate directly about problems, rather than hoping you'll figure out what I need without being told. I promise to build our life together based on what actually works for us, rather than what looks good to other people. My vows were similarly practical and specific. I promise to remain curious about your thoughts and feelings, rather than assuming I know you completely. I promise to make decisions that consider our partnership without losing my individual identity. I promise to choose honesty over convenience, even when the truth is complicated or uncomfortable. The reception was a dinner party at our apartment, casual and intimate, focused on celebrating with people who genuinely cared about our happiness rather than impressing acquaintances with elaborate displays. Emma's parents had flown in from Phoenix, my parents from Seattle, and our Portland friends filled the rest of the space with laughter and conversation that felt natural rather than performative. Standing in our living room, watching Emma talk with my mother about books they'd both loved, I felt the deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with romantic fantasy and everything to do with genuine compatibility. This was what marriage could be when it was based on actual understanding rather than projected ideals, when it enhanced who you already were rather than requiring you to become someone else. Later that night, after our guests had gone home and we'd finished cleaning up, Emma and I sat on our couch looking out at the Portland skyline through our floor-to-ceiling windows. "How does it feel to be married again?" Emma asked, curled up against my side. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the difference between this marriage and my first one. It feels like we formalized something that was already true, rather than creating something new. Does that make sense? Emma nodded against my shoulder. Perfect sense. We were already committed to building a life together. Now we're just legally and socially recognized for what we were already doing. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling grateful for the series of choices and circumstances that had led us to this moment. Victoria's request for space had seemed like an ending at the time, but it had actually been the beginning of something far more sustainable and satisfying than anything I'd experienced before. Emma had asked for space for her heart to figure things out. Victoria had said, not knowing that her words would lead to my divorce papers and eventually to this new beginning. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is to give them exactly what they ask for, even when they don't really understand what they're requesting. Victoria had gotten her space and whatever had come with it. I'd gotten my truth and the woman who appreciated it. And sometimes truth really was the most generous gift you could give yourself and everyone around you. 3 years into our marriage, Emma and I were having lunch at our favorite Vietnamese restaurant when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it absently, expecting a work-related message or spam, but the preview made me pause mid-bite. "Marcus, this is Victoria. I know this is unexpected, but I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet for coffee?" Emma noticed my expression change. "Everything okay?" I showed her the message, watching her eyebrows rise slightly as she read. "That's interesting timing. Didn't you mention that the final paperwork from your property settlement was supposed to be complete this month?" I nodded, thinking back to the loose ends that had taken years to fully resolve. Victoria had kept the Laurelhurst house, but needed to refinance to remove my name from the mortgage, a process that had been delayed by various complications with appraisals and lending requirements. "Want to bet she needs something practical rather than emotional?" Emma asked, taking another bite of her pho. "That would be very much in character," I replied, typing a brief response agreeing to meet the following afternoon at a neutral coffee shop downtown.
Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "How do you feel about seeing her again?" I considered the question honestly, curious mostly. It's been 3 years since we signed the final papers. I'm interested to see what version of herself she's settled into. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where I could watch the street. Victoria appeared exactly on time, which surprised me since punctuality was never her strength during our marriage. She looked different, more polished somehow, wearing a tailored blazer and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that suggested professional success. "Marcus," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I wasn't sure you would." I'd ordered her a cappuccino, remembering her preference despite the years between us. "You said it was important. What's going on?" Victoria wrapped her hands around the cup, a gesture I recognized from countless conversations during our marriage. "I'm getting married again. Next month, actually." The announcement didn't surprise me, though the timeline was faster than I might have expected. "Congratulations. Is this the same person you were seeing when we divorced?" She shook her head, looking slightly uncomfortable. "That ended pretty quickly after everything was finalized. This is someone new, someone I met through work last year." I waited for her to explain why this news required an in-person conversation. Victoria had never been one to share personal updates without an agenda. "The thing is," she continued, "Brian, my fiancé, he owns a consulting firm that's expanding into the Pacific Northwest. They're looking for someone with financial analysis experience to help with client assessments and market research." Now I understood. Victoria wasn't here to share happy news or seek closure on our relationship. She was here to offer me a job opportunity, which meant she needed something from me. "He asked me if I knew any qualified candidates," she continued, "and honestly, you were the first person I thought of. Your work has always been excellent, and I know you've been building your independent practice since the divorce." I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. Victoria was recommending me for a position with her new husband's company, which would mean professional interaction with both of them on an ongoing basis. Either she was remarkably confident in her ability to separate personal history from business relationships, or she was underestimating the potential complications. "That's an interesting proposition," I said carefully. "What kind of timeline are they looking at for this position?" Victoria pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be email correspondence. "They want to fill it within the next 2 months. The compensation would be significantly higher than what most independent consultants make, plus benefits and equity participation if the expansion succeeds." She slid a business card across the table. "Brian would like to set up an interview if you're interested. No pressure, obviously, but I thought you should know about the opportunity." I studied the card, noting the company name and Brian's impressive title. "Can I ask why you thought of me specifically? It seems like there would be other qualified candidates without the personal history." Victoria's expression shifted slightly, becoming more vulnerable than it had been since she'd arrived. "Because you're genuinely good at what you do, and because I owe you an apology that I never properly gave." This was unexpected. During our divorce proceedings, Victoria had maintained that our marriage had simply run its course, that neither of us was to blame for growing apart. She had never acknowledged the affair directly, or taken responsibility for the deception that had preceded our separation. I handled the end of our marriage badly. I was dishonest about what I was feeling and what I was doing, and I tried to make you responsible for problems that were really about my own confusion and cowardice. I appreciated the admission, though it felt like she was clearing her conscience than offering genuine amends. "What changed your perspective?" "Therapy, mostly, and time, and seeing what a healthy relationship actually looks like." Victoria glanced at her engagement ring, a simple solitaire that was much more understated than the elaborate diamond I'd given her. "Brian and I have very different communication patterns than you and I did. More direct, less strategic." I found myself genuinely curious about her growth, despite our history. "That sounds like it was valuable work to do." It was, and part of that work involved acknowledging that I treated you unfairly. I asked for space when what I really wanted was permission to leave without feeling guilty about it. I put you in an impossible position and then blamed you for not responding the way I wanted. The apology felt sincere, though I wondered how much of it was motivated by her current happiness versus genuine remorse about our past. "I appreciate you saying that. It helps to know that you recognize the patterns now. We talked for another hour, covering the job opportunity in more detail and sharing brief updates about our current lives. Victoria seemed genuinely happy in her new relationship, more relaxed than I remembered her being during our marriage. When I mentioned that I was also remarried, she appeared pleased rather than threatened by the information. "What's she like?" Victoria asked as we prepared to leave. "Direct, honest, curious about the world. We complement each other well without having to perform specific roles." Victoria nodded thoughtfully.
That sounds like what I was looking for but didn't know how to create. I'm glad you found it. Walking back to my office after our meeting, I reflected on how different this conversation had felt from the last time we'd spoken. Victoria seemed to have developed genuine self-awareness about her patterns in relationships, and she'd approached our interaction with straightforward business purposes rather than emotional manipulation. The apology had felt authentic, and her job recommendation seemed based on professional respect rather than guilt or nostalgia. That evening, I discussed the opportunity with Emma over dinner. She listened carefully as I described the position and the potential complications of working with Victoria's new husband. "What's your gut reaction to the job itself, setting aside the personal dynamics?" Emma asked. "It's exactly the kind of work I want to be doing, and the compensation would allow us to accelerate some of our financial goals. The company has a solid reputation, and the expansion into our market makes strategic sense." Emma nodded, cutting her salmon thoughtfully. "And how do you feel about the idea of regular professional contact with Victoria?" "Surprisingly comfortable with it. She seems to have developed better boundaries and communication skills, and the fact that she's recommending me suggests that she's confident in her new relationship and not concerned about potential awkwardness. Plus," Emma added with a slight smile, "you've developed better boundaries too. You're not the same person who needed to protect himself from her emotional manipulation." She was right. 3 years of marriage to Emma had reinforced my confidence in direct communication and healthy relationship dynamics. I no longer felt vulnerable to Victoria's tendency towards strategic conversation or emotional games, because I'd experienced what genuine partnership actually felt like. 2 weeks later, I had lunch with Brian Morrison at his downtown office. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of focused energy that successful entrepreneurs develop. Our conversation was entirely professional, covering market analysis techniques, client relationship management, and the specific challenges of expanding a consulting practice into new geographic territories. "Victoria mentioned that you two were formerly married," Brian said toward the end of our meeting. "I want to make sure that won't create any complications if we decide to work together." I appreciated his directness. "Victoria and I have a good professional relationship now, but no personal attachment that would interfere with business decisions. We've both moved on completely from our marriage." Brian nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "Good to know. Victoria speaks very highly of your analytical skills and professional integrity. That matters more to me than ancient history." 3 days later, Brian called to offer me the position. The compensation was indeed significantly higher than what I was making as an independent consultant, and the equity component had the potential to be quite valuable if the expansion succeeded. Emma and I spent a long evening discussing the pros and cons before I accepted. My first day at Morrison Consulting felt like stepping into a well-organized machine. The office culture was professional but relaxed, focused on client results rather than internal politics. My colleagues were competent and collaborative, and the work itself was engaging in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen financial analysis as a career. Victoria and I interacted occasionally, mostly in group meetings or brief email exchanges about client projects. Our communication was cordial and efficient, with none of the underlying tension or unresolved emotions that might have complicated professional relationships. She seemed genuinely settled in her new life, and I felt completely comfortable with our redefined boundaries. 6 months into the job, Victoria approached me after a client presentation to ask if Emma and I would be interested in joining her and Brian for dinner. The invitation felt natural rather than forced, a logical extension of our successful professional relationship. "Only if you're both genuinely comfortable with it," Victoria added.
I don't want to create any awkwardness, but Brian and I thought it might be nice to socialize with people who understand the consulting business. Emma was intrigued by the invitation when I mentioned it that evening. I'm curious to meet them both. It would be interesting to see how Victoria has changed and to get a sense of what their relationship is like. The dinner took place at a restaurant in the Pearl District, casual but upscale, the kind of place that facilitated conversation without being overly formal. Brian and Emma connected immediately over shared interests in sustainable business practices and urban planning. Victoria seemed more relaxed than I ever seen her before, less concerned with managing impressions and more focused on genuine interaction. "You two seem really happy together," Victoria said to Emma during dessert. "I can see why Marcus looks so content these days." Emma smiled, glancing at me affectionately. "We're very compatible. It took us both some trial and error to figure out what we actually wanted from partnership." "That's the truth," Brian agreed. "I was married before too, and that relationship was built on all the wrong assumptions about what marriage should look like." The conversation continued naturally, covering travel experiences, work challenges, and shared observations about Portland's evolving culture. By the end of the evening, it felt like we'd established the foundation for genuine friendship rather than merely professional acquaintance. Driving home, Emma reflected on the dinner with characteristic directness. "Victoria is completely different than I expected, much more self-aware and less performative than you described from your marriage." People can change significantly when they find the right context for growth. Victoria needed a partner who valued direct communication over strategic positioning. Brian seems to bring out her more authentic self.
And you needed someone who appreciated your analytical nature, rather than trying to change it into something more emotionally dramatic. Emma was right. Both Victoria and I had found partners who complemented our actual personalities, rather than requiring us to perform idealized versions of ourselves. The dinner had felt comfortable because we were all being genuine, rather than managing carefully constructed images. Over the following months, the four of us developed a casual friendship that centered around shared professional interests and occasional social activities. Victoria and Brian invited us to their wedding, a small ceremony in the Columbia River Gorge that was elegant but intimate. Emma and I hosted them for dinner at our apartment, where they met our book club friends and seemed to genuinely enjoy the conversation about literature and ideas. The friendship felt natural because it was based on who we all were now, rather than who we'd been in the past. Victoria had grown into someone who valued honesty over control, and I had learned to appreciate directness over diplomatic maneuvering. Our current relationships provided secure foundations that made platonic friendship possible without emotional complications. One evening, almost a year after we'd reconnected, Victoria and I found ourselves alone briefly, while Brian and Emma examined the art at a gallery opening. She turned to me with an expression of quiet gratitude. "I want you to know that I'm genuinely grateful for how you handled our divorce," she said. "You could have made it much more difficult, could have tried to punish me for the affair or drag out the proceedings out of anger. Instead, you gave me exactly what I asked for, even when I didn't fully understand what I was asking for." I considered her words, thinking back to that morning when she'd requested space for her heart. You needed room to figure out what would actually make you happy. I needed to stop trying to preserve something that wasn't working for either of us. It must have been hard, though, letting go without a fight. Fighting would have been about my ego, not about our relationship. The relationship was already over. Fighting would have just delayed the inevitable while creating more resentment. Victoria nodded, thoughtfully. "I think that's when I realized you were a better person than I'd given you credit for. Most people would have wanted to win, even when winning didn't serve any real purpose. Looking at Victoria now, settled and genuinely happy with Brian, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication or revenge. She'd gotten what she needed, I'd gotten what I needed, and we'd both learned important lessons about authentic partnership in the process. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is to stop trying to save them from their own choices," I replied. "You asked for space. I gave you all the space in the world, and we both ended up where we needed to be." Emma and Brian rejoined us then, full of opinions about the art we'd been viewing, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But as we left the gallery that night, walking through downtown Portland with Emma's hand in mine, I reflected on the strange circularity of life and the unexpected ways that endings can become beginnings. Victoria's request for space had seemed like a crisis at the time, but it had actually been the catalyst for both of us to build more authentic lives. Her words had freed me from a relationship that required me to be someone I wasn't, and given me the opportunity to find someone who appreciated who I actually was. The lesson wasn't about relationships specifically, but about the courage to let people show you who they really are and the wisdom to believe them. Victoria had shown me that she valued excitement over stability, novelty over depth, strategic positioning over authentic connection. Instead of trying to change her or convince her to want different things, I'd simply accepted that information and made decisions based on reality rather than hope. With Emma, I'd learned to appreciate someone who showed me that she valued honesty over performance, compatibility over chemistry, building something sustainable over pursuing something dramatic. The difference wasn't that Emma was a better person than Victoria, but that we were better suited for each other's authentic selves. Standing in our apartment that night, looking out at the Portland skyline through our floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt grateful for Victoria's request for space. She'd asked for room for her heart to figure things out, and in giving her that space, I'd finally given myself room to breathe. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give someone is exactly what they ask for, even when they don't fully understand what they're requesting. Victoria had gotten her space and found genuine happiness with someone who appreciated her real personality. I'd gotten my truth and built a life with someone who valued authenticity over performance. Emma was reading beside me, occasionally sharing interesting passages from her book, comfortable in the silence between conversations. This was what partnership looked like when it was based on genuine compatibility rather than projected ideals, when it enhanced who you were rather than requiring you to become someone else. Victoria's words had changed everything. I need space for my heart to figure things out. I'd given her divorce papers instead, which seemed harsh at the time, but had actually been the kindest response possible. Space to discover what would actually make her happy. Freedom to pursue authentic connection with someone who complemented her real personality, and the opportunity to learn that marriage could be based on truth rather than performance. The space had worked exactly as intended, just not in the way she'd originally imagined. And sometimes that's exactly how wisdom works, through unexpected generosity that creates room for everyone to become who they're meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.